Children generally stayed at Margaret's orphanage until she threw them out onto the street. She received no gold for looking after grown men and women, and had allowed Basher John to stay only because he was useful to her. Daisy and Martha both knew the time was coming when they would be thrown out, but they were less worried about themselves than for what would become of the little ones left behind. Bert and Roderick knew they'd have to leave around the same time, if not sooner. Bert's face was still stuck on the wanted posters all over Jeroboam. The four lived in daily dread that Ma Grunter and Basher John would realise they had a valuable fugitive worth 100 gold ducats living under their roof. In the meantime, Bert, Daisy, Martha and Roderick met every night while the children were asleep to share their stories about cornucopia. Huddled around a single candle as though it were a fire, Daisy told the boys about her kidnap. Bert shared his fears that his father had died in some kind of accident, and Roderick explained about the way the Darkfooters faked attacks on towns to keep people believing in the Ickabog. He also told the others how the mail was intercepted, how the two lords were stealing wagon loads of gold from the country, and that hundreds of people had been killed, or, if they were useful to Spittleworth, imprisoned. However, each of the boys was hiding something. Roderick suspected that Major Beamish had been accidentally shot on the marsh all those years ago, but he hadn't told Bert that because he was scared his friend would blame him for not telling him sooner. Meanwhile, Bert, who was certain Mr. Dovetail had carved the giant feet the Darkfooters were using, didn't tell Daisy so. You see, he was certain Mr. Dovetail must have been killed after making them, and he didn't want to give Daisy false hope that he was still alive. "But what about the soldiers?" Daisy asked Roderick on the 6th night they met in the cabbage cupboard. "The Ickabog Defence Brigade and the Royal Guard, are they in on it?" "I think they must be," said Roderick, "but only the very top people know everything. The two lords and whoever's replaced my father," he said. "The soldiers must know there's no Ickabog," said Bert, "after all the time they've spent up in the marshlands." "There is an Ickabog, though," said Martha. "I believed in it myself until I realised what was really going on," said Bert kindly. The four of them went off to bed later that night, agreeing to meet again the following evening. Each was burning with ambition to save the country, but they kept coming back to the fact that without weapons they could hardly fight Spittleworth and his many soldiers. However, when the girls arrived in the cabbage cupboard on the 7th night, Bert knew from their expressions that something bad had happened. "Trouble," whispered Daisy. "We heard Ma Grunter and Basher John talking just before bed. There's an orphanage inspector on the way. He'll be here tomorrow afternoon." The last thing the boys needed was for an outsider to recognise them as two fugitives. "We have to leave," said Bert. "Tonight. Now. Together we can manage to get the keys from Basher John." "Well, Martha and I are coming with you. We've thought of a plan," said Daisy. "What plan?" asked Bert. "I say the four of us head north to the soldiers' camp in the marshlands. Martha knows the way. She can guide us. And when we get there, we tell the soldiers everything that Roderick's told us about the Ickabog being fake." "It's real, though," said Martha, but the other three ignored her. "And we can tell them about the killings and the gold Spittleworth and Flapoon are stealing from the country. We can't take on Spittleworth alone. There must be some good soldiers who'd stop obeying him and help us take the country back." "It's a good plan," said Bert, "but I don't think you girls should come. It might be dangerous." "No, Bert," said Daisy. "With four of us, we double the number of soldiers we can talk to. Please don't argue. Unless something changes soon, most of the children in this orphanage will be in that cemetery before winter's over." It took a little more argument for Bert to agree that the two girls should come, but at last he agreed. "All right, you better grab your blankets off your beds because it's going to be a long, cold walk. Roddy and I will deal with Basher John." So Bert and Roderick snuck into Basher John's room. The fight was short and brutal. It was lucky Ma Grunter couldn't hear them, what with her bottles of wine with dinner, because otherwise all the banging and shouting would have woken her. Leaving Basher John bruised, Roderick stole his boots. Then they locked him in his room and the two boys sprinted to join the girls who were waiting beside the front door. It took 5 long minutes to unfasten all the padlocks and loosen all the chains. A blast of icy air met them as they opened the door. With one last glance back at the orphanage, threadbare blankets around their shoulders, Daisy, Bert, Martha and Roderick slipped out onto the street and set off for the marshlands through the first few flakes of snow. No harder journey has been made in all of Cornucopia's history than the trek of those 4 young people. It was the bitterest winter the kingdom had seen for 100 years, and by the time the dark outline of Jeroboam had vanished behind them, the snow was falling so thickly it dazzled their eyes with the whiteness. Their thin, patched clothes and torn blankets were no match for the freezing air, which bit at every part of them like tiny, sharp-toothed wolves. If not for Martha, it would have been impossible to find their way, but she was familiar with the country north of Jeroboam, and she recognised old trees that she used to climb, odd-shaped rocks that had always been there, and ramshackle sheep sheds that had once belonged to neighbours. Even so, the further north they travelled, the more all of them wondered in their hearts whether the journey would kill them, though they never spoke the thought out loud. On the third night, Martha knew they were close because she could smell the familiar ooze and brackish water of the marshland. All of them regained a little hope. They strained their eyes for signs of torches and fires in the soldiers' encampment, and imagined they heard the men talking through the whistling wind. Every now and then they saw a glint in the distance or heard a noise, but it was always just the moonlight reflecting on a frozen puddle or a tree creaking in the blizzard. At last they reached the edge of the wide expanse of rock, marsh and rustling weed, and realised there were no soldiers there at all. The winter storms had caused a retreat. The commander, who was privately certain there was no Ickabog, had decided that he wasn't going to let his men freeze to death just to please Lord Spittleworth. So he had given the order to head south, and if it hadn't been for the thick snow which was still falling fast to cover their tracks, the friends might have been able to see the soldiers' 5-day-old footprints going in the opposite direction. "Look," said Roderick, "they were here." A wagon had been abandoned in the snow because it got stuck, and the soldiers wanted to escape the storm quickly. The foursome approached the wagon and saw food such as Bert, Daisy and Roderick remembered only from their dreams, and which Martha had never seen in her life. Heaps of creamy Kurtzberg cheeses, piles of Shoeville pastries, sausages and venison pies of Baronstown, all sent to keep the camp commander and his soldiers happy, because there was no food to be had in the marshlands. Bert reached out his numb fingers to try and take a pie, but a thick layer of ice now covered the food, and his fingers just slipped off. He turned a hopeless face to Daisy, Martha and Roderick, all of whose lips were now blue. Nobody said anything. They knew they were going to die of cold on the edge of the Ickabog's marsh, and none of them really cared any longer. Daisy was so cold that to sleep forever seemed a wonderful idea. Bert sank down and put his arms around her, but he too was feeling sleepy and strange. But then a vast shadow rippled over them. 2 enormous arms covered in long green hair like marshweed descended upon the 4 friends. As easily as if they were babies, the Ickabog scooped them up and bore them away across the marsh.